All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on the issue regarding appointment conversion. If you have any concerns or questions that arise during our presentation, I would recommend writing them down for open discussion near the end. We will make sure to get to every question during this discussion, but we do want to make sure we're moving at a decent pace, so please table it and maybe your question will be answered. All right, let's get going. First is the summary of the issue. So, our goal as schedulers is to coordinate patients with their care effectively while generating revenue for our healthcare group. To monitor both of these goals, our department utilizes a metric referred to as appointment conversion. Specifically, this is the statistic that measures the percentage of interactions that our schedulers had with patients that resulted in at least one appointment being scheduled. Our goal for 2025 was to have a year's end appointment conversion of 28%. However, as many of you may have understood, our group maintained an average between 27 and 27.5%, depending on the specific scheduling area. As the revenue generated from outpatient health groups, like ours, are largely dependent on the amount of appointments that are scheduled, this was definitely a concern that was raised. From this concern began an opportunity to do some research, both internally and externally, to determine what would be the best course of action. So, by doing our research, as you can see listed here, these are our findings. Through everything, we came to learn the importance of hospital communication and its impacts on outpatient operations. And you'll see how that rolls into our strategy. Our focus was on what we could specifically do to impact appointment conversion directly, though. We realized that there are certain tactics in communication typically used in the line of sales that could be used to potentially increase our appointment conversion. Typically, this would be to present a rebuttal to an initial refusal of an appointment, much like how a salesman would come up with an alternate offer if the original offer was not accepted. We also had an opportunity to speak with our clinical partners during this process, and we received various forms of feedback. Many of them were actually a bit surprising. First and foremost, we learned that the providers have their schedules adjusted in a very specific way, where they only meet with the patients for a certain period of time for a 30 or 45-minute appointment slot, meaning a majority of the time the patient is waiting for the doctor. That was something we were looking into. But additionally, many of our medical assistants mentioned how they have a distaste towards our scheduling team. Many of them preferring that instead of having a dedicated scheduling team, that they would vastly prefer to schedule patients themselves. And this was something that they've admitted they corroborated with patients often and have gotten a mutual agreement for. Now, while looking more at our specific performance data, it was clear that the data was a bit erratic. It was difficult to find any specific trend year over year. But as we looked a little bit deeper, such as results from the COVID-19 pandemic or due to changing administrations of the presidency and the government of the United States, that various different socioeconomic factors and pressures have seemingly a direct impact on people's hesitancy and willing acceptance of healthcare in the industry. So we got a lot of data. And while reviewing all the data, we also wanted to determine what was not only the best solution, but what was going to be the most feasible solution. So we had a lot of brainstorming. We filtered through a lot of options, and we did ultimately decide on a proposed solution. So, when choosing a solution, we wanted to ensure that not only was it backed by our own research, but it was also financially feasible. So, while looking at the options we had available, that led us to one proposed solution, which was to create and implement a behavioral training advising staff to not speak poorly about any staff member when communicating with patients. This came from that surprising bit of information that we received from our clinical staff, where they would often corroborate with patients about distaste towards the schedulers. This creating a lack of trust for the scheduling department and potentially a lack of willingness to secure appointments when speaking with them. Again, this was a surprise, but we realized this was something that needed to be addressed quickly. How this would go is we would roll out a training for our clinical staff and implement a behavioral change quickly, rolled out in short order, and make sure we're keeping it cost effective. While it may take time to train each relevant clinical staff member, the financial benefits of increasing appointment conversion, even by just a single percentage point, is massive. So it is worthwhile to take a look into. While going through the details of our cost benefit analysis, which you can see much of the information listed on here, we are able to see that the costs of this solution far underweigh from what the overall benefits are. Over 1 million in terms of benefits, and that's not even going into the increased patient retention, which could bring it upwards of a 2 million plus net gain. For a prospect that doesn't really cost us as much money, it definitely becomes one of the most financially feasible. Combining that with the overall time frame, we do view this as a very efficient and effective solution. Now, the details of the cost benefit analysis are listed here, but we can review more in detail some of the specifics here on the very next slide. Here are our steps for implementation. Associate managers will be responsible for creating this training, materials which can be done uh, within about 2 weeks or so, finishing the materials, I should say, with this prospective team. We've actually already began work on it, so we should be hopefully finishing that soon. After that 2 week evaluation period, it will then take roughly a week for this to be rolled out to our clinical managers and for them to train our clinical staff. Not all the staff will be pulled out as once, but rather be rolled out in individual, well, not individual, group trainings that are set throughout the course of that week. Following that week will be a 30-day follow-up period, which we will have a deeper evaluation of in the next slide, but just to more closely observe the reactions from the training. Currently, we are working on expediting this. So we are planning this to actually go live the week of the 11th. That's about 2 weeks away. So we are pretty ecstatic about that and very hopeful that we will be making that due date for the training materials. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the evaluation. So, how we're going to be monitoring the performance and the success of this implementation. So we will be instituting the 30, 60, 90 follow-up plan. This is standard for our spaces, but is also a very effective space for evaluating the success of a training recently after it's been completed, then after a bit of time for it to be established, and then by the time we expect it to be fully integrated into our workflow. The initial follow-up period will be within the first 30 days. That will be a period of close observation. What we have at this point is that clinical supervisors will be stationed within earshot of clinical staff when they're speaking with patients directly to observe the communication. One thing that's very important is that we do want to avoid this method becoming too identifiable. We do want to resist defensiveness to being formed in our clinical staff. So instead of saying, hey, we're monitoring you, making sure that you're doing everything right, this will be more of a subtle and passive observation period, pretty much exclusively advised to those chosen clinical supervisors. After which we will then be heading to the 60-day follow-up. At this point, results from those first 60 days will be tallied, compared to our appointment conversion scores that we have received earlier in the period, as well as how it's been impacted currently, and also roll out specific training and even more coaching if the training is not being implemented into their workflows. And while that continues up to our 90-day follow-up, we will then be further gathering data now that we'll have several months worth of data and be comparing that to not only historical appointment conversion, but also our current one. If we do see that a correlation exists between the training and an increase in appointment conversion, we will take that as a successful implementation of this training. However, if there is still room and opportunities to further develop it, we may look to further hold individuals accountable for their contributions speaking with patients or evaluate even further solutions to further resolve this concern. And altogether, our goal is in collaboration. So while appointment conversion may be specific issue to the scheduling team, maintaining patient trust and appointment quality is a responsibility of all of our staff. Now, our motto is we are one team, and we want to make sure that we are operating with this directive in mind. So through this implementation, we are hoping for a greater respect for our fellow employees, which translate to further revenue generation and a better patient experience altogether. I do want to thank everyone for coming to this meeting. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?